All right, our next speaker and our final speaker of the morning is Dr. Paul Spudis, who many of you know, the senior staff scientist at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory and the visiting scientist at the Lunar and Planetary Institute in Houston, Texas. Now, Paul has really been a leader in lunar science for many years. He's been showing the way forward for what we will do and what we can learn on the moon. So it's highly appropriate for him to sort of close out this morning's session on lunar-focused topics. Just summarize his biography. In 2004, he served on the President's Commission on the implementation of U.S. space exploration policy, the so-called Aldrich Commission that Dr. Leschen was on as well, receiving the NASA Distinguished Public Service Medal for his work. Dr. Spudis is the principal investigator for an imaging radar experiment on the Indian Chandrayaan-1 mission for launch to the moon in 2008. He was deputy leader of the science team for the Department of Defense Clementine mission to the moon in 1994, very important mission. And in 1990 to 91, he was a member of the Synthesis Group, a White House panel that analyzed a return to the moon. He received the 2006 von Karman Lectureship in Astronautics, awarded by the American Institute for Aeronautics and Astronautics. He's authored or co-authored more than 150 papers and 4 books, including The Once and Future Moon in the Smithsonian Library of the Solar System series and the Clementine Atlas of the Moon. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Spudis.
It's always great to be the talk before lunch. By the way, if this talk doesn't come out well and you don't like it, I am not Paul Spudis, I'm his digital avatar. Could we have the next slide, please? I knew Lori was going to pretty much cover the science associated with lunar return, so I didn't really want to talk about that. I wanted to step back a little bit and look at a broader question, and that is the question of where are we in the implementation of the vision. So what I want to cover basically is what the vision really is, or at least what I think it is, where we are, what things NASA is doing, both right and wrong, and then kind of close with a wistful look at what I would do if I were running the show. And please note the disclaimer at the bottom. It's especially important for the people that I work for. Next slide. Fundamentally, the vision can be summarized very simply. It consists of 5 pieces, and we've already accomplished step number 1. That's return the shuttle to flight. The next step is to basically complete the assembly of the ISS and to retire the shuttle, followed by the building of a new human spacecraft for transport to LEO and beyond. So in a nutshell, that's sort of where we are at the moment. We're in the initial design phases of designing the CEV. Then the task is to return to the moon with people and machines to explore and prepare for voyages beyond that, and finally human missions to Mars and other destinations. Next slide. Well, that's from the White House handout. You can find that on the web. But what does it mean? What is it really all about? I think that fundamentally the vision was about reorienting the space program along a different path. It was to develop a strategic direction and then try to establish a program that was sort of self-sustaining. I mean, fundamentally that was the object of enunciating the vision. And it was driven in sort of a crisis. It was driven by the realization after we lost Columbia that we really had lost our strategic bearings in space. So the idea was that NASA's not going to get a lot more money, but they could, if they're clever, they might be able to architect a program with small, incremental, and cumulative steps so that each thing you do, even though it may be a little piece, actually builds on the other, and to basically expand the reach of humans in space, to go beyond LEO for a variety of reasons, and basically answer the question, can people live off planet? Next slide. So why the moon next? This has been covered ad nauseum, and you probably already know the reasons, but fundamentally, the moon's important because it's close, and B, it has the material and energy resources we need to create new spacefaring capability. So largely, the moon is the first target because the moon is the target that's the next obvious step after LEO. It's not an imaginary spot in space, it's a real place. It's another world that we can go to and learn how to live and work on that world. Next slide. Now I want to briefly talk a little bit about the Commission because the Commission actually did issue a report. We were only in existence for 6 months, and I actually think we had some pretty good recommendations in it. And it turned out that, like all presidential commissions, it was largely ignored. That's the fate of presidential commissions, I'm afraid. But at the same time, I think maybe we ought to re-examine them a little bit and consider the possibility that there may be something worthwhile in there. I've listed the principal findings, and you can see it's a long, lengthy list, but I want to focus on the ones that I've outlined in green, because I think that outlines a path for NASA that the agency is reluctant to go down for reasons that are actually quite understandable. Next slide. Now, there was a great deal of thought given both in our public meetings and in our private deliberations about the relationship between NASA and the private sector. And one of the most important recommendations I thought we made was that NASA should contract for services where it's available. And specifically, the example that we gave was LEO access. To get things into low Earth orbit, we should contract for that rather than build new vehicles. And yet, the ESAS, the new architecture system, builds a new vehicle, primarily to bring CEV to low Earth orbit. We also recommended independent technical cost and innovation oversight. The idea here was that you would get people from outside the agency to basically advise the agency on where it was making good progress, where it needed to give more attention, and to use its contracting authority and other incentives to nurture a reinvigorated space industry. There was great concern on the committee that the aerospace industry in this country had eroded since the end of the Cold War, and to revitalize it, the vision was a good way to do that, but to do that, NASA had to take a hand in actively seeking that kind of innovation. And one of the things that resulted from that, I'm happy to say that NASA did partly listen to that, was the Centennial Challenge, which is a good program, but I think it's not really as good as it could be, simply because it's not being used as aggressively as it ought to be. Finally, we recommended that we seek international participation and investment, and both of those words are important. Next slide. So where are we in this? Given in the list of things that we're trying to do and in the list of things that we recommended, where are we? Well, we have one robotic mission in preparation to the moon, that's LRO, with its auxiliary, the L-Cross. There are no plans for any follow-ons at the moment. We do have an architecture, a vehicle architecture. The CEV and launch vehicle are defined from the report called ESAS. And finally, we have this list of 181 objectives, lunar return goals and objectives, which is primarily the product of the LAT. Next slide. So let me briefly comment on what I think NASA is doing right. One of the most important decisions made early, and again, it can always be changed again, but I think it was the right decision first, was to basically base the LSAM around the RL-10 cryogenic engine. The reason that that's important is because that will allow you to use the propellants that you make on the moon. And making lunar propellant and developing the capability to routinely go back and forth to the lunar surface, I think is a key thing in making the vision a success, because it not only gives you access to the moon, it also gives you access to all of cislunar space. There's a focus on the outpost rather than individual sortie missions, and the reason that that's a good decision is because that allows you to build up your resources and your capabilities at one site and not dissipate them by going to multiple sites all over the moon. So effectively, if you go to 10 sites on the moon, you throw away every piece of equipment every time you go. If you go to one site, you can use what you deliver to the moon to build up capability at that area. They also tentatively decided to go to a polar site, and the reason that that's important is not because of the possibility of water ice there, which, by the way, I'm going to talk about this afternoon, and is in fact an enabling asset. The real value of the polar sites is the fact that they are in near constant sunlight, at least parts of them are. And that is an asset because it's nearly impossible to survive the long 14-day lunar nighttime unless you go nuclear, unless you have a nuclear reactor. So fundamentally, the quasi-permanently lit areas allow you to stay on the moon nearly constantly without going nuclear. And finally, there's an involvement of the internationals at this very early stage, so I think that's a good thing as well. Next slide. Now, what's NASA doing wrong? Well, I think one of the biggest mistakes, I think, was the idea that we're not really planning for an extensive series of robotic missions. Basically, LRO is it. Originally, it was strictly a money-driven decision. There was a plan for a robotic architecture that called for multiple landers, it called for additional orbiters, it called for a variety of different activities, and that was part of the LAT. And when money became tight, that went. Now, they did throw it out last, but the simple fact is that now I'm hearing from various people at the agency that there's no real need for it. And in fact, all you really need is a good map to go to the moon. And I do not agree with that. I think there's a real role for robotic stuff, and I'll talk about that in a minute. They decided to go to the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous rather than L1 staging. Now, that sounds like a good idea, a good architectural decision. L1 staging does provide, there is a delta V penalty for staging your mission from L1 versus low lunar orbit. The advantage of L1 is that if you ever get to the stage where you're exporting material from the moon, you want to export it to L1. You don't want to export it to low lunar orbit. Simply because if you're going to make propellant that you're going to use in cislunar space, you want to collect it at a spot that's easy to get to and accessible at all times. The Ares launch system is basically a shuttle-derived system. It has all the disadvantages of a shuttle-derived system, but none of the advantages. Effectively, you're developing and building two brand new launch vehicle systems. You're going to have to retool the VAB. You're going to have to build new launch pads. You may even have to build a pad 39C to accommodate Ares 5. So there's a huge capital investment in doing this. Whereas, if they had decided to do Shuttle C side mount, you could stage a nice lunar mission using two Shuttle C launches, 60 metric tons to LEO, and you could do an L1 stage mission. I think the biggest problem, though, and I was struck again today by listening to the presentations that, dealing with the NASA lists for going to the moon. NASA still doesn't really understand what its mission is. They're in the mode of trying to satisfy all their constituencies, so they're developing catalogs of reasons rather than embracing a mission. Now, I've always thought that if you can't state your mission in a single sentence, you probably don't know what it is. And in a single sentence, the vision, the mission to the moon part of the vision for space exploration, we're going to the moon to learn how to live and work on another world. It's that simple. And when you accept that, a lot of the things we want to do and a lot of things we ought to do on the moon become very clear. Next slide. So one of the big problems I see right now in the current implementation of the architecture is that Mike Griffin is very worried about the gap between the retirement of the shuttle and the first flight of the CEV. While all this is going on, while we're focusing on our spaceflight gap, the world is beating a path to the moon. Right now, there's two missions that are going to be launched to the moon, one by China and one by Japan this year. The Japan is a lunar orbiter, Selena. The Chinese mission, Chang'e, they're both going to be launched this year. Next year, India is launching Chandrayaan-1, and the US is launching LRO. And fundamentally, they're all doing the same thing. They're all mappers. They're all orbiters. They're carrying the same stuff. They're carrying imagers. They're carrying compositional mappers. There's no coordination whatsoever. So, on the principle that possession is 9/10 of the law, if everybody's up there and we're not, when we get to the moon, we're going to have to rent our spot on the rim of Shackleton from the Chinese. Finally, I would claim that CEV without the moon is shuttle without the station. It's a vehicle with no destination. Next slide. Just a little comparison of historical antecedents to this. Fundamentally, I think we're in an analogous situation where we're building the shuttle 30 years ago. That effectively, the concern then was build the vehicle and don't worry about where it's going. And I'm afraid we're getting into that very similar situation right now. Next slide. So, how do you do this? Given that these are some of the difficulties, how do you take the collection of independent fiefdoms that NASA really is and forge it into an agency to execute what something is as broadly based as the vision? I think that the key here was actually laid out very early. The key is to develop an incremental cumulative program. And that was the idea originally when the vision was first laid out by the OSTP people, and that's what I think has been lost over the last couple of years. Next slide. Okay, what are some of the things we need to do? What are skills and assets that we need to do this vision right? I think that I've just listed some thoughts down here that I think are all relevant to the VSE, and not only to going to the moon, but also to the VSE as a whole. And fundamentally, it all builds toward building a spacefaring infrastructure. I mean, fundamentally, if you can go to the moon and you can mine the moon for propellant and consumables, and use that to routinely go to the moon, you have created that system. You have created the system that you need to go to the planets, to go anywhere we want to go. So these are some of the things that we need to be thinking about. Next slide. How would I do this if I were suddenly made the king of NASA? And notice I said king, not administrator, because I recognize that the administrator has to answer to 100 masters, and all of them want different things. But let's just, for a moment, let's have a little fantasy. Let's assume that we really wanted to implement the vision. We really wanted to accomplish this. How would you do it? Well, first of all, I think the key thing is to develop alternatives to launching the CEV. That right now, I think the Ares 1 is not the optimal solution. It is shuttle derived, but unfortunately, because now we've gone to the 5-stack segment and a new engine for the upper stage, we don't get any of the benefits of shuttle derived. So we need to relook at this idea and think about maybe launching the CEV on an evolved expendable launch vehicle or even a new commercial system. I would create an incremental robotic presence on the moon. In other words, one of the big criticisms of the original vision was, well, we're not destination-based. This is a vision that's going to accomplish a lot of different things. I think they need to be destination-based. If you're destination-based, you know where you're going, you know what you're trying to do. And the way to do that for the moon is to build up a robotic presence before people get there. It doesn't have to be a series of billion-dollar missions. You can do this with a variety of size missions depending on the scale. What you want are robots to survey and prospect. Then you want tech demos to show you, to actually demonstrate the processing materials that you're going to be doing when you get to the moon. And then finally, once you've decided what processes and what kinds of things you're going to be doing in activity, then use robotic missions to place infrastructure. So effectively, when the astronauts arrive on the moon, they move into a turnkey operation. And then I would aggressively use the private sector to augment the capabilities for both of these things. So that includes not only LEO access, but includes things like data purchase, and includes things like tech demos on the moon. I think you can structure a program to do that, and that way it gives you the maximum leverage in the least amount of time, I think. Next slide. Now I'm showing this slide. I actually nicked this slide from talk from Bill Jeffries, who was the space guy at OSTP in the days when the VSE was being formulated. He had a very interesting idea. He looked at this graph in constant dollars of NASA funding as a function of time, and he noticed something very interesting, and that is after the 1970s that the graph flattened and it was pretty constant. Yeah, sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down, but effectively it was about little less than 1% of the federal budget is the NASA budget. And his hypothesis was that this percentage is politically sustainable. So his thought was, well, if we can find a way to enlarge the size of the pie, given that this is a fixed price kind of thing, that's the path we ought to go down. And so he focused on the idea of using space resources to enlarge the size of the pie, to basically use lunar resources and asteroidal resources and planetary resources to make the kinds of things we need to create spacefaring capability. Next slide. So what does sustainability mean now? Well, that was the original concept. As you phased out the shuttle, you would use those funds to build your exploration systems and then start creating new capability on planetary surfaces using these kinds of technologies. But the revised concept is a little different. Basically, we don't have quite the money that we hoped, so instead the sustainability means you tear up the STS infrastructure and then basically defy Congress and the President to cancel manned spaceflight. In other words, you're going to make Ares the only game in town. And so the idea of sustainability is to present them with a fait accompli. Yes, do you want human spaceflight or not? Next slide. Well, I think there's an alternative way of looking at the sustainability, and it pretty much follows along what I've been talking about. I think we need to look at be a little more innovative, because fundamentally I think you can do this if you're clever. One thing that really has struck me as I look at what NASA's doing, what the plans of ESAS are, is there really isn't much use for ISS in going to the moon and Mars. And I think it's a major mistake. I think ISS is a major asset that you could use. And just to give you one example, one thing I would do is I would launch 500 pounds of water to the station. And then I would practice playing with that in space. I'd crack it using solar power. I'd freeze it and make cryogens. I'd practice transferring cryogenic fluids and microgravity. Those are the kinds of skills we need to do to go to the planets to build a spacefaring infrastructure, something you can do on ISS. I would establish a robotic presence by basically using all different sizes of robotic missions. Small sats, nanosats, picosats, yes, but also big ones. There was a very good study done as part of the early robotic missions on building a cryo-based lunar lander using it around the RL-10. In fact, Hugh Davis was heavily involved in that, which could basically deliver 2 metric tons of the lunar surface. In other words, making a lunar progress. Suppose we have people on the moon someday and we lose another vehicle on a launch. Are we going to basically abandon those guys? Are we going to abandon the lunar outposts? If you don't do that, how are you going to supply them? If you built a cryo-based robotic lander, you could do that. You could supply them with the supplies they need to survive that hiatus of flight. And finally, I think we need to pace the program to the available resources. I mean, It seems that a lot of this is being driven by the perceived gap, minimizing the human spaceflight gap. But I'll point out, we survived gaps before. We survived the gap from 74 to 81 when Apollo was basically out of business and Shuttle came along. And we've also survived the gaps after the Challenger and the Columbia disasters. So I also think you need to basically invest in revitalizing the aerospace industry, because unless we have that industrial base, we're not going to be able to do a lot of this stuff. Next slide. There is a difference between now and the Apollo era, and fundamentally Apollo was primarily on a war footing, and there was a sense of national imperative. We don't have that now. I also think that there's an increase in the overhead, the managerial overhead on projects. There's much more than there was in those days. And I think the last point, post-Cold War deterioration of the technical infrastructure, really has struck me recently, because in working on my imaging radar experiment for Chandrayaan, I'm finding that a lot of my delays are caused because I can't get the parts I need. Whereas 30 years ago, I would have been able to get them from any number of different small vendors. All those small vendors are gone. And basically the aerospace industry is consolidated into a few mega giants, some of which don't really do the kinds of innovation the smaller companies used to do. Next slide. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's interesting. There's sort of three paradigms for spaceflight. This is not my observation. A lot of people have advocated this. There's sort of the three different ways of looking at space. There's sort of the Saganite way, which is science uber alles. There's the von Braunian way, which is basically doing national strategic things in space. And then finally the O'Neillian vision, which is yes, space settlement, but also the idea of thriving human communities, which basically means the creation of wealth, if you're going to have that. Next slide. Well, where does different people fall on this category if you plot this as a ternary plot? NASA falls along the left side of the triangle. Basically, the biggest part of NASA is down in the bottom left corner, and there's a significant fraction that trends up towards the Saganite apex. The thing I liked about the VSE was it was starting to move NASA off that bottom part of the triangle toward the other apex. It was at least a step in that direction. Next slide. So the strategic value of the moon, in my mind, has a lot of value. It has scientific value, it has operational value, it's a test bed. The biggest value, I think, is a logistics depot, because once you can start making stuff on the moon that allows you to travel in space, then you can go anywhere you want to. And the last slide, next slide. So, what's my conclusion on all this? I think the glass is half empty and it's half full. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. And in contrast to the prevailing wisdom, I don't think this is primarily about money. I think it's about attitude. I think it's about understanding what your mission is and determining how to do it cleverly, despite the fact that you have obstacles in front of you. Now, have we reached a point of no return? I don't think we have, but I think we are getting close. And finally, make no mistake, someone is going to the moon. Humanity will do this. I think the only question is, will the USA be a part of it or not? And if the NASA version of the VSE fails, then I think that's going to set us back a long way. That's going to take quite a bit to recover from. Last, please. So I'll just conclude there. I didn't intend to give this talk. I actually thought originally that I was going to talk a little bit about exploring the moon and what we could learn, but the simple fact is I want this to happen. I think this is the best idea to come along as far as the direction for the space program in a long time. I'm very concerned that it's not going to happen. So I'm not as optimistic as Lori is. I don't mean this to sound too pessimistic either. I'm concerned, and I wanted to express some of these and share some of these concerns with you today. Thank you very much. No comments, huh?
Surely there are a few questions out there. Yes, right down here in the front.
Sure, I'll talk. Nobody else. You make the most sense of anybody I've heard in any talk over the past 5 years.
But I'm not kidding you.
I'm just sorry you're not an engineer. I'm an engineer. You got infrastructure part, you know? So congratulations. I really like what you have to say.
Thank you.
There's two other things that you probably are aware of. That NASA seems to be completely ignoring the synergistic issues of reusable spacecraft and orbiting fuel depots with a single HLV launch, put a fully functioning fuel depot in Earth orbit, lunar orbit, L1, wherever you want them. And then you would be able to build up your lunar fuel oxygen on the lunar surface, ship it up to lunar orbit or wherever. And you, with your lunar reusable spacecraft, the crew is actually much safer because when the spacecraft takes off with the crew cabin intact, then if the maintenance stage fails as they take off, the crew still has an out. There's no parachutes on the moon, they don't work. So if the crew cabin alone takes off and it fails, the crew dies. So there's a lot of real rationale for that path, and they seem to be completely ignoring that path.
No, I'm not ignoring anything. What I'm suggesting is that when ESAS undertook the way of building an architecture to go to the moon, they looked at something they could implement with the minimal budgetary impact that they could. They weren't thinking about extensible systems, about transportation nodes, about refueling depots, all those things. Yeah, they'll say, okay, yeah, we'll do that in the future, but they're not thinking in those terms now. They're thinking about the easiest way to get to the moon. That's why the whole Apollo on steroids approach. So I didn't mean this to be all encompassing. I wasn't offering, here's the way I would actually do all this. I was meaning to suggest, here's a few things that ought to be looked at and thought about more.
Yes, in your talk you mentioned that the CEV has to have different launch alternatives, and I agree with that. I've actually spoken to several groups on that subject, and the different options we have, like the ELPs and Chelsea, etc. Do you, now since you spoke up, do you have any ideas of what incentives we might get NASA to consider other alternatives, other than areas, other ideas that are
They're not going to consider an alternative. They're committed to this, such as it is.
So,
more is the pity.
In the case, is there anything we as citizens can do to bring other alternatives?
Well, I mean, you're free to write out, speak out, and write to the administrator and do all that. I just don't think it's very likely that it'll be listened to.
So what will be listened to by whom, to whom?
Well, when something crashes and collapses, then they'll listen to somebody else.
So in other words, we aren't going to get this, what we're needing. The National Space Society, is wanting spacefaring.
Well,
you're saying we can't get it unless there's a major disaster, in which case we might actually.
Well, look, we got the vision as a result of a major disaster. So all I'm saying is that they had to make decisions, and I respect that, and they made choices. Some of the choices are good, some of the choices are not so good. And I think as this proceeds, we'll see what's sustainable and what isn't.
What is your solution to the problems you brought up?
Well, I tried to show some of those, some of the things I would do if I were running this, but I'm not running it.
Yeah, what I was meaning was, you brought up some solutions that are technical and economic and managerial, but we're not going to get there unless we get something done differently.
Well, if you're asking me, is there a political solution, I have no great genius in that area any more than anyone else. I do think that if you structure a program such that you're doing recognizable achievements and milestones on a recurring basis, you have a much higher likelihood of being politically sustainable than if you don't do that. So one way that one prescription for non-sustainability is to say, I'm going to build a new vehicle and then I'm going to take people to the moon in a decade.
Mm-hmm. So, well, you've certainly given us some interesting thoughts that we certainly need to pursue. So thanks a lot for that.
Thank you. I don't want to keep people from lunch, so.
Are you in favor of reinterpreting the existing treaty framework to allow for private property rights that can help with exploration?
Yes, although I don't think that's as critical as a lot of people do. I've talked to Jack Schmidt and I have talked about this, and I've sort of come to the conclusion that it's not really stopping us much. I mean, ultimately it may. We may get to the point where the legal regime is going to create a problem for us, but I think at the moment there's nothing stopping anyone from going to the moon and mining it and keeping the products and selling it for profit. But the answer to your question is yes, ultimately, I'm in favor of making that the law.
A couple of prior questions have sort of taken my question away. I would like to raise a philosophical point and see if you agree with it at all. NASA wanted a space shuttle in the worst way, and that's what it got. Then after getting a space shuttle in the worst way, it wanted a space station in the worst way, and that's what it got. And now we want to go back to the moon in the worst way, and that, in many people's opinion, seems to be what we're going to get. But I'd like to raise a Machiavellian idea, which is to say that we don't really want NASA to be too successful, because in the creation of this white elephant, ISS, and now they have something that they have no face-saving way to back away from. And so therefore they are forced to turn to the commercial sector to rescue them with things like COTS. And I wonder if the same thing won't happen with the moon. They may come up with something that is quite overpriced and of very limited functionality, but not be able, from a political face-saving point of view, to back away from it, and thus be forced to turn to the private sector that actually knows how to execute it.
Well, that may well happen. Your crystal ball may be better than mine. I don't know how that's going to end up, but I wouldn't go as far as you are in saying. First of all, let me address one philosophical point that I think is behind your question, and that is, well, why should NASA be doing this anyway? I think there are important national strategic reasons for us to have access to the lunar surface. And so therefore, I certainly support the whole idea that NASA should be going to the moon. Now, how they choose to do that, that's a whole nother debate. But I certainly think that just like I agree that commercial entities have something to do on the moon, I think the U.S. government has something to do on the moon as well.
Running the objectives list through the keep it simple, stupid principle. Our objectives are the exploration, exploitation, industrial development, and settlement of space with a goal of creating a free spacefaring civilization. I don't think you can say it simpler than that and cover it more completely.
Right. Sounds fine to me. I thought I was saying exactly that when I said we're going to the moon to learn how to live and work on another world. So that's my attempt at saying it simply. We got it.
All right. I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut it off there because we do need to get folks wandering over to the luncheon. So I wanted to thank everyone for coming out, and thank you, Dr. Spudis. That was great.